Another Mindgasms podcast. Got Shane Kennedy back here, and we're going to do just a short episode talking about the recent Canadian federal election that happened, in which Justin Trudeau was reelected as Prime Minister again. So, yeah, you want to start off with just sort of reiterating your thoughts that you were telling me about before we started this, Shane?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'll just rhyme off two basic narratives about the election. One is, how did it come to be that each party got the number of seats? And I think the story there is pretty self explanatory. Trudeau just had not performed well enough, and there's lots of civil anecdotes we might go into as to why he lost what he lost.
Yeah, we should go into a few of those.
We can grab a couple of the conservative basic narrative is Scheer just couldn't deliver and didn't have any kind of magnetism enough to really galvanize what he would need to galvanize. And then the side note there is that actually, if you took a look policy by policy, you could make an argument that it's really not that conservative. It's probably it's a pretty centrist. You probably would have got something pretty centrist and a lot more tolerable than you might expect if your conception of any conservative is to say like a social conservative perspective. So that's the basic narrative there. And then with Jagmeet's, the one thing we hadn't mentioned yet, Andrew, is the twin reality for both the Bloc and the NDP, where the NDP had lost party status, I think, for 2 or 3 elections in a row, and now all of a sudden, I mean, you might even go legitimately to a sense of not Quebec not always being the most aligned with people of a non-Quebec persuasion.
That's why the Bloc Quebecois never win.
Well, their job isn't to win. Their job is to set up a bunch of people who will make sure Quebec gets an outsized benefit from Confederation, and they have a 106-figure salary and a parliamentary budget to make sure that happens, regardless if that actually creates the most constructive win-win for Canada at large, Quebec included in that dynamic, and instead you get some suboptimal Quebec. Quebec seems to get ahead, but are they really? And you could debate that forever.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that dynamic really cut down the NDP, and I don't know enough to know if the fact that Jagmeet Singh seems to be a human being, and I don't know how he fared in the rest of the country specifically, but probably not the worst. So
yeah,
so that's my basic overview.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like we were saying before, or like I was saying before we started this, and I know some of my family members are borderline gonna disown me for saying this too, but when I was actually looking at the official federal policies of all of the candidates this time, there were roughly an equal number of policies that I agreed with between both the NDP and the Conservatives. And I would say I'm a fairly left-leaning centrist, but as you were saying, I would say that if you look at Andrew Scheer's actual platform, it's at least relatively or even fairly left-leaning for a conservative platform. And personally, there definitely are aspects of his platform that I don't like. But like I said, even though for all of the parties I disagree with the majority of all of their platforms, there are just as many, like I said, just as many aspects of the NDP platform that I liked as there are the conservative platform. And what the linchpin that convinced me to vote for the NDP rather than the Conservatives were that I looked at the platform of my Alberta NDP MP candidate, and I liked more of his policies than the Conservative guy. But like I was also saying before we started this, I voted for Justin Trudeau the first time, but I didn't this time because even though I think it is a historic achievement that will go down in history that he legalized weed, I can't think of anything else that he did or said that I liked. And he showed that he's corrupt and lied about it with that SNC-Lavalin scandal, and also that he's a hypocrite for firing the first minority woman in that position. And I personally don't care about that brown face stuff, but to me, showing that he's corrupt and lied about it was the reason for me to not vote for him. And uh like I and like I was saying too before we started, when I was watching the acceptance speeches last night, and even though I voted for the NDP, I was watching the acceptance speech of Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, and the congratulatory speech of Andrew Scheer, and Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh seem to speak rather almost completely in platitudes, and Andrew Scheer spoke largely in platitudes too. But to me, he seemed more genuine actually, because like I was saying, Trudeau said that it was the greatest honor of his life to serve his country, and then it went to Andrew Scheer in his speech. He said, "It's the greatest honor of my life to be a father to my children and to be a husband to my wife," and that seemed a lot more genuine to me. So yeah, that's my whole spiel.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of went into this, but I'll rephrase it slightly. Um, like I would, what I would say is, I would say if people were to, let's say, like we all don't want to be a slave to our biases, right? So to the extent that you can kind of look at a platform and look at the specific, like say, manifestation of this conservative leader and today's conservative party with today's reality, and at least give that some chance to vote for it. Like, because ideally you'd like to, there should be at least 2 to 3 parties that conceivably you could vote for, given given a range of priorities, right? So I mean, I think the conservatives just get a lot of short shrift because a lot of things get projected on them, right? Like when Trudeau, one thing that really I found despicable that Trudeau did in particular. It's like, it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to judge people based on the color of their skin and their genitalia when I decide to hire, promote them, or in policies. And I don't think that's something you should do. I would call that bigoted and racist. But I mean, if you're doing it nominally for something that's about some form of desirable equity representation, you might have a convincing argument there. So, we good people can disagree on that. But when he came out and tried to call Shearer racist, it's like, come on, dude. Like that's just the worst form of like of disingenuous labeling, right? Like, and then before you get into the issues of him, I wouldn't want to call it brown face, because blackface is like a specific theatric type of making fun of black people, and it has like the white circle around the mouth. That's a very particular thing. And then to lump in any form of costume that changes your race, whatever that is, as the exact same thing as openly mocking a race through a specific means. I don't think that's the same thing. But anyways, to
Oh,
kind
for
of wrap up,
sure.
yeah.
I
So to
just
cut,
called it brown face because that's what I heard people call it at first, before people started calling it blackface as well. I don't even really actually know too much of the details other than that he did that. He confessed to doing that at least 3 times.
yeah, well, yeah, 3 times, and he cannot hold himself accountable to remember whether those were the only three. you know,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, I mean,
I don't
who
know. I do it so much, I just can't keep track.
yeah, who keeps track of how many times they paint their like, the dude was painting like his the patches in his legs were like, he every part of his body, because like original blackface is literally, I'm pretty sure it's just a giant circle on the front of your page. It's more like a painted on mask than it really is like actually trying to be mistaken for a black person, right? Like, it's not like that. What's that guy's name who went all Asian and crossed his eyes in some movie, and he's actually trying to like make you think he's an Asian person to some extent, right? Can't remember what
Oh, I don't
famous
know.
actor, Mickey Rooney, or I think did that. Anyways,
Oh, okay.
yeah, but yeah, the thing about Sheer, which I think Sheer could have done, is serve two things. Like, one, there's a correct way to be kind of direct about Trudeau's failings without going into like pedantic, like, inside poker, jargon, daily political nerd type descriptions of every little thing that Trudeau said. And the other thing too about the debate, I didn't listen to it, but I heard a little bit in an Uber, and I talked to a couple people, and they were just miffed. It's like, why aren't you talking about policy, right? So if Scheer had come out and said, okay, you know what, I'm obligated to point out and condemn these certain things that Trudeau did. I'm just going to make it known, say it one more time because I need, it's appropriate to say it. But what I'm going to use the majority of my time to do is, and you don't have to phrase it this exact way, but point out that what I'm offering is a centrist, policy where I'm conservative in the sense that I'm going to retain the rights of Canadians to make decisions that reflect their own morality. So we're not going to force people I'm not going to force left or right wing things on anybody in this country, which I think all Canadians and most Canadians could get behind. But on the other hand, I'm not going to. I'm going to. Here's 5 policies because that's what Harper did. That was amazing. He had his 10 priorities. Here's 5 or 10 things that I'm going to do that I think the middle 80% of Canadians can get behind. I'm going to keep raising healthcare costs at a reasonable rate. I'm going to blah blah blah, whatever. Make 10 public services better in 10 different ways that isn't just as simple as slashing budgets and isn't just as simple as dumping money on a fire to try to
Hmm.
put it out,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I think if he had done that, people could have been like, you know what, Scheer actually said 6 of those 10 things he said. I actually could agree with, and hey, and maybe he could have been, and he was the only one actually talking about, bread and butter kitchen table issues. Maybe I will. Maybe Netflix isn't better than not voting.
Well said. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. I agree. That probably would have been a better strategy for him. And yeah, I mean, I kind of expected Trudeau to lose with all the scandals and stuff, so I was a little surprised. But I mean, I did watch the that debate, and I mean, a lot of it was, what you would expect. But I found it kind of interesting, even though they didn't. That was one of my complaints too, that they largely didn't focus on policy, which really didn't surprise me. But I mean, a few of the things that stood out to me were that, of course, Maxime Bernier of the People's Party of Canada, he was just being kind of an annoying douche throughout the whole thing. And for example, and Trudeau didn't answer the question that Andrew Scheer asked him about the SNC-Lavalin scandal. He just did this whole word salad thing of avoiding the question. And there was another part that I liked when Justin Trudeau, he keeps saying in terms of his climate change policy that it's the only policy that's going to lead to real change. And Elizabeth May, leader of the Green Party, pointed out, no, you're lying, because he said we have reached our goals, but we need to do more. And she pointed out, no, you're not telling the truth. You didn't even come close to reaching your reduction of emissions goals, and your climate change policy is not as progressive as my policy. And then there was, oh yeah, I thought it was interesting too that Jagmeet Singh, even though he himself is, I'm honestly not sure whether he's a Muslim or a
The Sikh.
Sikh.
He's
He's a
Sikh.
Sikh, okay, and he would be subjected to the consequences of this policy that was passed in Quebec, banning basically any form of religious dress, which would mean that he couldn't wear his, I think it's called a turban, the head thing that he wears.
Is it called the
He,
turban? Yep.
I'm not sure. It might be
I'm pretty sure.
different for Sikhs, but I think it's called a turban.
I'm
Anyway,
like
I
90.
kind of respected the fact that he said that even though he would suffer in reaction to those consequences, he would not use his federal power as prime minister to get rid of that bill that was passed in Quebec. And Andrew Scheer commended him for that too. And like, even though I personally think that policy being instituted provincially or at any level is really terrible, I respect a politician saying that they wouldn't use their federal power in that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll rhyme off that last thing and maybe make one other point. But I was having a conversation with Gregory before this, and he's
Greg
been on one other
Sandstrom?
episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he was asking some people today, what would you define secular as, and what would you define secularism as? And what I said was there's 2 definitions of secular. What I think the original, let's say, British definition might have been is something on the lines of There's some appropriate place for there to be a secular realm, which probably would be politics and economics, and there's some appropriate place for a religious realm, which would be in, say, the realms of voluntary associations. And it's right and proper to draw that distinction and keep some appropriate balance between how those realms interact and what it should be, right? And then there's a second definition, which is, I think, what Quebec's trying to do. And I could say why they're trying to do it, but I won't right now. But the second definition is what secular means is the removal of all public expressions of religion. And it's just the trying to reduce religion to solely a private thing. And
Okay.
and that's where the definition of secularism comes from, because it's the ideology of knowingly or unknowingly having it essentially an agenda of destroying the capacity of religion to operate in public in any way, shape, or form. Because
That sounds like kind of a one-sided view of secularism.
um, well, I mean, there's probably multiple forms of secularism, but I mean, one simple way to look at it is like this, right? It's like
That just
I,
seems
I
more authoritarian to me.
Well, exactly, right? I mean, because some people do operate that way. Some people will say it's like I value, let's say, being green. Okay, so I can get up in public and say I have a personal value of being green, and I want progressive and economic policies that reflect that value, and that's a proper justification as to why I will do what I want to do. Now, even though that's my belief system, I don't. That doesn't get called religious. That can never be called religious in any way. As long as my value system doesn't explicitly involve God, I can reference it as much as I want in any realm and express it. I can wear a green pin, a green T-shirt, a green turban. If it's for greenness, I can do whatever I want as long as it's for greenness. But
No
the
matter how
moment,
religiously you act about it, right?
yeah, no matter how religiously you act about it, that's completely okay. That's me being secular. But the moment I see anybody else bringing a religious value system as the justification for why they want a policy or a thing, it's like, whoa, no, 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 no. Those values can't be represented in a policy or in a point of view. You have to have a completely quote unquote secular justification for it, a non-belief system justification. And that's where I think knowingly or unknowingly a double standard gets applied. Like some people, like I say, you can legitimately say our social policy in healthcare should not be explicitly honoring religious values like no blood transfusions. That's not a religious value that should be honored in the way we do healthcare policy, and that would be a completely legitimate form of secularism, right? But I think all too often what you see is that and probably just out of if nothing less, just a desire to win, people are willing to say, "Gotcha, you claimed a religious value, ergo, I can dismiss you, attack you, and claim that you're fundamentally one of the fundamental dictums of what it means to be secular, is a separation of church and state." And I think you see more and more of that, right? Like the best example that concerns me the most is like. If I'm running a private school, like say I run a private law school, and I don't accept money, and I'm in BC, and I want to have a Christian school where I train lawyers, for you to come in there and say, we want to have a value of chastity reflected in the code of conduct of our students. Oh, no, not only can you not get government money, you can't even train lawyers. We won't recognize a single person out of your school. We're gonna and then or what Beto O'Rourke wants to do. It's like if you won't reflect every progressive value in the way you operate your religion, you're going to lose your charity status. We're going to shut down your church. We might even put you in jail or sue you because you don't reflect the progressive value of marrying a self-identifying man to a self-identifying woman when each of them has the opposite sexual organs, and they even say out loud they're just doing it to prove they can do it. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You don't have,
Yeah.
it's so that's
Well,
to me that's yeah.
this is all why I personally disagree with that bill itself banning people from wearing religious garb, basically, because I personally think that even though, as you know, I consider myself an atheist, I think that people should be allowed to express themselves in any fucking way they want to, as long as it as long as it doesn't harm anyone else. And clearly, like, wearing religious symbols has no harm on anyone, in the same way that, like, as you were saying, wearing, like, symbols about being a conservationalist or an environmentalist or something, or any form of like secular worldview or anything like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that either, as long as you don't like use authority, like government authority, to try to oppress others from expressing themselves in the same way.
Well, exactly, right. And I mean, that's really where it comes in. It's like the traditional deal in society is you don't violate the harm. As long as you don't violate the harm principle, then you don't use the power of force or fiat to control people's behaviors. And
For sure.
that's the kind of the live let thing that means that we can all exist in a union and we can share a common identity across a large value set. The moment you start the moment you start saying no, certain values, even if they don't harm somebody, but they harm my sensibilities or my sensitivities, that's even off limits. That's when you start creating situations where it might not lead to a hot civil war, but you can see it. Well, it leads to what was often called the culture war, right? Where it
Yeah.
takes a form of a level of antagonism that just it's 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 just super dangerous, and I would contend, and I think most reasonable people would agree, it's short term and kind of self defeating to be that antagonistic in a democracy, because it takes a certain amount of goodwill and respecting the democratic process to sort things out and not just use any means and all means possible to achieve whatever it is you want. And if you can get away with it, then like if you get ahead, then the devil can take the hindmost, because I just don't care about that. I think that's the kind of thing that leads to the worst examples of what humans are capable of, and I see far too much of it around, and it's really irks me. So I tend not to talk about it too much. But
Yeah, well said. I agree. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, and like and you just look at what in Quebec, right? Like this might not be completely true, and I'm sure there are people of better intentions, but you can make a pretty convincing case that the idea is, with that religious ban, is to try to get rid of anything, any symbol or thing that it runs against, like what is the, let's say, the pure lane kind of Quebec culture. Call it secularism as a justification, instead of calling it like some form of ethnic supremacy or cultural domination, or whatever else you want to call it. It seems to me that it's a lot more dicey to say, oh, no, we just want this quote unquote secular French culture to exist, than it is to say, no, we just want to basically discourage anybody who's not what I think of as a proper Quebecois person wanting to live here. And if I can use secularism to get there, then yeah, sign me up, baby. Like, um,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
mm, and yeah, so it's rather unfortunate. Is there?
I like your title that you suggested for this, because that's like my opinion of what is indicative of the whole situation. Trudeau wins and the world still turns, because like the the way I felt about the candidates is probably the way that most people feel, although I actually am surprised with a few people I've interacted with, like my one family member who I've told you about before, who is far more progressive than me, who literally posted a meme of Andrew Scheer that said, "Fuck you, poor people." And ranging from that all the way to me arguing with people in that party that wants to separate from Alberta, saying, regardless of what you think about this in terms of values, this is not going to happen. But that's that's my long-winded way of saying what that my thoughts were that regardless of who gets elected, not that much is really going to change. So, and that's why I think that even though I honestly don't like the fact that Trudeau wins, I think honestly, if either, like I said, if either Jagmeet Singh or Andrew Scheer got elected, it would be better than what Trudeau is doing, but not that much better, because often politicians of any kind are fairly disappointing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's pretty on point. Um, it's yeah, it's weird. It's like there's a certain there's this interesting idea that Eric Weinstein keeps coming back to, that I think he's the only one who's really said this. Because so there's this idea that like part of free speech and like let's say democratic discussion, what you would want to do is you really want to have everybody at the table, right? And like
Yeah.
and then but then a step beyond that, it seems also pretty, in parliaments there are certain rules for decorum, right? And like they're flaunted, but there's certain hard lines, let's say, right? And most people would agree you need to have some format or structure to a conversation. Now, the interesting point that Eric Weinstein makes is that there are certain, like I think you'd even say adult discussions, where there's a certain bend of person whose goal is to just render actual communication uh, impossible, whether they're doing it intentionally or not. Like the best example would be air horns as a legitimate form of expression, right? But the idea is that if, say, I don't mean to crap on your family member there who posted that but I would imagine that that person, even if I put in front of them, hey, here's 30 policies of Andrew Scheer. None of them involve crapping on poor people. And here's actually some that actually are specifically, it can make a defensible, reasonable case that they will help poor people. It's like, can this enter into?
There's one I think I could be wrong about this, but I seem to remember reading in his policy that building like housing projects for building houses for low income families, he had a higher budget for that than any other party, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, see that exactly, right? So if a person like that won't even let that enter into the way they communicate, then I think you can make a legitimate case that they're going to make a productive conversation, uh, if not impossible, much less likely, and that there's a legitimate place for not inviting those people to a conversation. Like you can't exclude them from their democratic rights. Obviously, you can't oppress them, but you don't have to feel obligated to hand them the microphone at your event, right? It's like that's not serving a utilitarian or any kind of high-minded ideal. It's just you shooting yourself in the foot. And
For
and
sure.
there's that, yeah. So there's that idea, and another idea that a lot of who was it who keeps talking about this? Um, Somebody at my church, but this applies. This is something you find with a certain type of evangelical, or let's say a certain type of like NPC-ish person on the left, right? Which is
Yeah.
you'll have a conversation with them. I'll just give a concrete example. So I bumped into an evangelical on the street, and he's trying to explain to me how Catholics aren't going to get into heaven. Okay,
Whoa.
and I'm like, Catholics aren't going to go into heaven because they're serving something about the exact nature of the Catholic Church and its corruptions. Ergo, you're not able to actually be a Christian in that context or in that church. So the solution, of course, is to become born again as an evangelical, and then salvation's back on the table.
So
Okay.
like an evangelical Protestant of some kind, presumably, right? Like
Yes,
what specific type of
he
Protestantism?
he had like life on fire, some catchphrase with like fire of Christ or something. Like become become born again and get the fire of the Holy Spirit or something along those lines, right? It's not all bad.
Okay.
Um, but so what I said to him is I've said like, look, okay, let's assume that we could have legitimate criticism of the Catholic Church, but if what you're saying is some Italian peasant or lower class person or normal like rural Italian person only ever encounters Catholicism, lives a life that arguably is as giving and loving as any evangelical. I don't think telling that person, pragmatically telling that person they're automatically damned is going to really send them in the proper direction. And to go a step further, I don't think in any kind of, well, what I would consider a reasonable conception of Christianity, that if you're hoodwinked by something and you fall in with the wrong type of Christian or group or whatnot, if you be a good person, it's honest mistakes, and then you repent like you're supposed to. And because like one of the things you're supposed to say when you repent is, I know I did some bad things. I know there are bad things I don't even know about, but I'm trying here. I'm earnest. You know, let me put the past in the past and be as good as I can the next day as this day. And that's essentially, as I understand it, all you really need to do to potentially get God's grace or to get your your salvation reward. So, anyways, to kind of round this point out, the basic idea is I can have that conversation, and by the end of it, he's not agreeing with me, but he's like, okay, kind of see you have a point there, maybe, kind of softening his hard edge. But the idea is you talk to that person 24 hours later, you're right back where you were when you started the conversation.
Yeah.
Like it's just a reset button. And this kind of feeds into Weinstein's point because I think everybody's guilty of this, but I think on some issues, even if you end up going on an intellectual journey through a discussion, it's like your goal is not actually to be changed. Your goal is just to like go through the conversation. If it works and you serve whatever end you want, then it's great. But if you could have learned something, it doesn't really matter. You're just going to hit the reset button, and with those, that's why debating is no longer something I really value very much anymore because it's like,
Mm.
what am I serving? Like
Well,
even if you concede,
to me that's why I really try to be open-minded even to ideas that I totally disagree with. And even though I'm fucking terrible at that, sometimes for sure, like I definitely shit all over people intellectually on social media because I disagree with them sometimes. But I was
yeah.
like, so in like another one of these memes that the person I told you about posted was that agree to disagree does not apply to homophobia, misogyny, um, denying climate change science, racism, and denying vaccine science. And
uh,
I had went on a long spiel about how, like, for example, I have a friend whose mom is racist. Like, is she supposed to disown her own mother because she's racist? I mean, racism obviously is terrible, but if your mom is racist, are you going to like try to convince her to not be racist maybe, or just never talk to her again? And like also, I've most of my bosses unfortunately have at one time or another revealed that they are racist, sexist, homophobic, and or misogynist. And I think that that's a terrible worldview that I disagree with. But uh, if I need a job, I'm gonna kind of probably work for them, even though I disagree with their ideas. And like, for example, there are gay people who are friends with people who are against gay marriage, like Dave Rubin, for example. I know everyone hates Dave Rubin, but that's an
yeah.
example that I'm thinking of. And then also like I always tell people about Daryl Davis when they act this way in terms of racism. He's a black musician who literally makes friends with Nazis and converts them out of their Nazis and Nazism and white supremacism. And like I was saying too that like this open-mindedness that I at least try to practice is why last New Year's at a friend's family member's house when we went to like just a little family get together, there was a guy who is work friends with the dad of my friend whose house we were at, and he basically started talking about creationism and denying evolution in favor of creationism. And I obviously thought that was ridiculous, but I basically just asked him about a bunch of really critical questions like, what's your evidence for that? Where do you get that idea? How do you know this? That sort of thing. And I mostly just asked him questions. And then by the end of, like, it wasn't just me, it was a few other people. But by the end of our conversation, he at least once said, you've kind of convinced me. I need to give a little bit more thought to my opinions on this. And to me, like, that's definitely a good thing if that sort of thing can happen.
Well, exactly, right? Because like if you show them that, being being willing to have a discussion and focus, which basically means I value respecting you more than I value having to force you to agree with me. And if you can show doing that, then maybe they could do that. Do that for other people, and you're probably at least that way you might be able to get rid of the oppression on these groups. You maybe can get people to move to tolerance, even if they still have, some, you know, some negative stuff under the surface, and then the doors open for perhaps them to even, let's say accept as opposed to tolerate. and that's I mean that has to be your goal, right? But I mean, I think a lot of these people, it's more important for them to signal their true believer status to the extreme, like just give me a sword and I'll cut down all the bad ideas. And if I hit the people who hold them as well, well then you know what? A little blood spilt for the progressive utopia might just be what's called for. You know, like come on, give me a
Yeah,
break,
definitely.
you Twitter warrior.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, the thing about that too is that the vast majority of these Twitter warriors are just Twitter warriors. Like they don't do much actual in real life, I would say.
yeah. Well, one
And
one
if they
guilty
do,
pleasure.
and if they do, it's like yelling at people at public events and stuff like that.
Well, one of my guilty pleasures is, I mean, I was in love with Star Wars, and slowly realizing that I almost don't care anymore is like was enough that I every once in a while I watch some of these nerdier videos. The guy with the 1,000 toys and comic books in the background, like whatever speaking,
I
and
love
like
watching those sometimes.
yeah, exactly, right. And one thing they say is like, look, man, it's like this person's goal isn't to buy your product, isn't to isn't to really even care about it. They just need a target and they want the satisfaction of knocking something down that nominally they have an issue with. And when you kowtail to them, you're not serving your core audience. These people are never going to give you their money anyways, so it's really just self-defeating. And you're seeing more and more examples of like Joker might be a good example. Is you just say,
Oh, I
look,
so want to see that movie because of all the outrage.
yeah, I went to see it. I need to watch it again to kind of get a better feel on it. But I mean, you can make a pretty convincing case that Phoenix and the director, whatever his name is, their attitude was like, look, this is not a political statement per se. It's an exploration of a theme. That's what art. That's one of the primary things most people think art does, and what people go to watch movies for is to explore an idea or emotional space, and that's what we're doing. And we're not going to apologize for it, and we're not going to be belligerent for it. We're going to let it speak for itself. And guess what? We're going to hold that line for 2 weeks. We're not going to cave. And you know what? That opens the door for what exactly happened, which is on merits. People wanted to see it, and it's going to do what it's going to do. And I think that's a much more intelligent, even if you're just solely business minded. It's like, don't cowtail, don't provoke per se. Just do the best product you can do, and let the chips fall where they may. Because if you do anything else, it's not gonna you're not gonna get what you want from it, and you're probably gonna lose something you did. So
Yep, that's the power of artistic expression. It has a power, like it seems like right now in particular it has a very powerful effect on culture. And I think that's both like that's sort of a double-edged sword. I mean, it's a bad thing in that there's this cancellation culture, but it's also a good thing because there are people who subvert this cancellation culture and win out against it, like the Joker, for example, like you said, or like Dave Chappelle's new comedy special in which he deliberately made fun of like the LGBT community and all these things that you're not supposed to make fun of.
yeah. Well, there's an interesting idea. My Gregory is really into Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan tried to have the same way you have Aristotle's four original causes. He wanted to create some sort of mirror version of four effects of, and I think it was specifically more probably in the technological innovation space. Let's say, so some of the effects were like, it's going to change this, it's going to make more of this, like things like, pretty unobjectable, pretty descriptive, right? But the fourth one was, if you take something too far, you're going to create some version of the opposite by definition. There's going to be some sort of whiplash back. And I think that's, I mean, and the moment I heard that, I'm like, oh, that is so true. Because
It's like a
what you
horseshoe effect.
yeah, exactly, right? So I mean, for me, one way this is expressed in me is like, I mean, like I was as I still am in a lot of ways as liberal as all get out. I was super libertarian. I was totally live and let live. Like, as long as I get my freedom, you can have all yours. It's all good, right? But then eventually, when these people got so authoritarian with those same values that I would have given them a second ago, but the moment they start trying to force it on me, it's like I can't help but say, not only do I want to personally act out conservatism? I feel I need to even instantiate it in the culture more, just to even be able to have that negative right to express it myself. So now all of a sudden I might have to actively oppose some of your methods because I know you're going to take them so far that you're like that. I'd rather you lose a little bit of negative freedom that I would want to give you, but I know if I give it to you, I'm going to lose even more negative freedom, so I can't even give you your due anymore. And I'm going to end up having to be a harder line on some of the things that I am on. And I'm just like, geez, like, am I just becoming old and conservative? Or is this like just the only reaction as Martial influence, like the effect that you're going to get from it? And it's been really, I think I'm fairly self-reflective. So it's been interesting to kind of watch what I'm doing and what values it represents and being like, wow, they're really pushing me to do this. And it's like, and it seems to be right. And I didn't see that coming. So here we are, you know?
You sound you sound like kind of reactionary in a way, but it makes me think about how I am. Well, I just like to be contrarian. I wouldn't say necessarily that it's like left wing ideas that are um more putting pressure on me to go in the opposite direction. But that's because like for me, I have a lot of family members who are more left leaning than me, and then because of where I live, I have a lot of friends who are more right leaning than me. So it feels like I'm just constantly switching back and forth between if I'm talking with people I know who are more right wing than me, I'm like basically taking left wing positions and arguing against right wing positions. But then if I'm talking with some of my family members who are more left leaning than me, I'm sort of almost taking right wing positions against left wing positions.
Oh yeah, I mean, oh yeah, I find myself in the same boat as well, right? And like I had a conversation the other day, and basically this person was going, like, how do I say this? Um, let's just say there were like reasonable points mixed up with things that drifted or fully became like the actual definition of alt right, and it's like, and what I found myself having to do was, well, I don't really have any space in this conversation to say, hey man, so there's some grievances that make sense there. There's some truth mixed in. I don't want to just be a contrarian, like and not give you any of your due. But now that you've gone so far, it's like, well, there's that one extreme statement or idea I have to push back against. So this conversation ended up becoming, it seemed like we had nothing in common, and we're not enemies, but whatever. We're on opposite sides of everything. When in reality, it was just, well, you pushed it so far. All I can do is exactly what you said you do, which is just represent the other side, because your narrative or point of view just was so one-sided. I can only balance that by being one-sided myself, which is not
Yeah.
really the most ideal way to communicate, I
Yeah.
think, in a lot of situations. But
Sometimes I forget to like make caveats saying I agree with you generally, but it's most of the time I'm saying I agree with you generally, but I disagree with your execution. I often forget to say that, and I probably sound like I'm a right winger sometimes when I'm disagreeing with more left wing ideas, and I probably sound like I'm more left wing than I actually am sometimes when I'm disagreeing with more right wing ideas.
yeah, I think a lot of people are kind of caught in this in this situation, right? And I think part of the reason too is that because people don't have as much common language, common narratives, common media they consume as they might have once was. It's not as easy to like use phrases or references that show, oh, okay, you just agreed with this movie and some of its themes. So in one sentence, I'm able to understand that we have all these things in common. That, oh, there is this common ground that can be communicated very quickly with words and memes that we agree with, so that then I can move in precisely to this one little thing we want to discuss about. And because we have that kind of common ground, like, it's not as heated, so it's a little bit more patient. People on both sides, you know what I mean? Like that, there's this chain reaction of kind of more productive conversations, let's say, as opposed to like the thing we're just kind of lamenting right now. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. So
Yeah, totally. I like how this evolved from being cynical about politics into how to try to have better conversations. That's very good.
yeah, yeah, and better conversation and less virtue signaling, rain dancing.
Yeah, less rain dances. As I was talking about this before we started, the new one of the main aspects I love the most about the new Jonathan Haidt episode of the newest Mixed Mental Arts podcast that recently came out is Hunter's rain dance metaphor, which he basically applies to virtue signaling. Like, feels really good, but it doesn't actually do anything.
Well, that's like the dissonance, right? Like I think like I'm a big believer in multiple levels of analysis, kind of ways of looking at things. That's where like the whole fractal thing comes in. And like as an individual, it's like we often like some things we really like, we hide the dissonance that, oh, actually, my love of being a productive person, I'm not really going to examine how that lines up with the fact that I surround myself with people who just encourage me to do the least productive things with my time. And then and the reason I brought up the dissonance on an individual level is like we all do this, but sometimes in conversations like, especially if you're talking with academic types who are doing virtue or rain dancing, it's like, okay, well, which is it? Are you a scientifically minded, empirical person who wants like some sort of evidence or modern I actually care about results kind of mentality to govern how I make decisions because I'm probably one who also, rain dances or virtue signaling is about being better than people who are just driven by baser xenophobias and all these other things all these other labels. I'm better than that. But at the same time, when it comes to my cherry pick sources that make me look good and give me social credit, all my cares for any other standards kind of jump out the window.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
I
why,
think this.
like, to me, the rain dancing is so dumb because if you actually, like, if you don't talk to people who you think have disgusting ideas, then you're going to ensure that they still have disgusting ideas and that there are always people around who have disgusting ideas because you didn't bother to try to talk to them.
Well, see, and that's the funny thing, like especially with the green issue, and this kind of comes back to something I wanted to say earlier. On the green issue, like you have people like Shapiro, and it's becoming more or less a consensus that okay, they've willing to acknowledge there is a problem here, right? So there's
Mm-hmm.
actually a space where you could say if you can actually show how your progressive or green policy will address this problem, then there then I'm now saying pretty explicitly I will agree on that based on my new internal standards, right? So that's why when you come out and make it about a rain dance thing, it's like, well, because like I don't know if you listened to Peter Thiel was talking to Eric Weinstein, and I like both
Yeah, I
those
saw
people.
that episode. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? And that's the whole thing. It's like most of these problems, if you could just solve it financially, and this applies, I think, in so many realms, it probably would. He didn't say this, but my idea, it probably would already be solved. If it was just a matter of dumping money on it, right? And that's what Bill Gates kind of shows with what he does. It's like, oh, geez, it wasn't as simple as me just throwing money at all these problems in Africa. I actually have to use all my implementation abilities to oversee exactly how it's spent, and that's where the rub is. So that's why I actually have to do a full-time job running this $1 billion fund or whatnot, right? So it's like, so the thing with the green solution, it's like these are problems because there's real things that the only way to do them is really messy. So it's not just as simple as saying stop doing messy things. You need to. It's not about harping on the messiness so much as it is actually giving somebody an action item that can actually solve the problem. And
Mm-hmm.
if you can do that, right? So it's like that's where you need to be.
Like
And
something like giving people jobs to set up the infrastructure that would be required for societies to run on renewable energy systems.
exactly, because it turns out, like, I don't know if you there's this guy, he's worked for like Bangladesh and India, and he's done like analysis for like entire countries, and he rank orders how much nominal, how much the economic plus and minuses of a whole bunch of social programs. And what it always ends up showing is that every dollar in human nutrition, you when you get hello. Hello?
My
Can you hear me?
my picture froze for a sec. I can hear
No
you
worries.
though.
No
Yeah,
worries.
you
Yeah.
can hear
So
me.
he it basically ends up
Oh.
showing is that every dollar you put into human nutrition, because you have one more productive human who can make that new technology or create GDP to solve problems, you always get your biggest bang from the buck having another healthy person with everything they can do. And then things that sound great, like, a marginal increase in like water quality, although it's awesome, at the end of the day, having 5% less healthy people versus having another 100 healthy people who aren't dragging down the system but lifting it up is almost always better. And that's those true social programs as investments. The education, the nutrition, the bodily safety, those things are always what get the most bang for the bucks, because you're creating the very mechanisms that actually do all these other things that you'd want to have done.
Yeah,
So
yeah, totally. Yeah.
yeah, so it's a bit frustrating with the green issue, because I remember when I was in the long haired guy in the conservative young conservative movement there in university. They always called me the hippie conservative, because I was I was super pro green issues, and then when I realized that the whole movement was completely being hijacked by rain dancing, I'm just like I'm just like I'm not. I'm just not going to play in that realm anymore. Like I'll honor nature. I interact with it a lot. I've done a lot of gardening and all that. But it's like when it comes to actually talking policy, I'm just like, dude, invent a better solar panel, or just stop talking to me, right? Like,
Well, it's like it's a big thing that requires a lot of work, and it's like people don't take it seriously enough, I would say, which is really unfortunate. Like
yeah,
like you said, even the environmentalists don't take it seriously enough, unfortunately.
yeah. Oh, just a small little caveat. Like, I might make it to my charger before my battery runs out. I might not. But if I suddenly disappear, that's just my dramatic exit from the discussion, because my phone has died, and we'll just call it a day. So
All right.
I mean, we'll go back and we'll just talk a bit till that ends. But I'll just say, yeah, good conversation either way, and looking forward to the next time. But so with that caveat out of the way, um, yeah, I mean, it's what was I? Where did I want to go next?
You were talking about the environmentalism.
Yeah. What can I segue that into? Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the big, and that's the I think the two like from like a evolutionary perspective, it's like, and this is what Weinstein would talk about a lot. It's like this. He calls it like the programming towards tribalism. That you need to rise above your evolution to kind of deal with. I think that's the root of brain dancing and virtue signaling. It's like always throughout history, it's more important to be in with your group than out, because the moment you're out, you're dead. And that's like the over liking of sugars and fats is the same as this. It's something that's just been so important in the past that it's now just on steroids, and it runs amok, right?
Totally.
And I
Yeah.
and I think and then the downside of what secularism has become is, instead of people having, let's say, their belief system or religious systems be explicit, so we could all actually have a conversation about values, like openly and honestly, and all agree that we all have value systems and talk about it like adults. Secularism has become like, like that meme. There are certain values that are immutable, and they're never religious, and they're never up for debate, and that's just the way it is. And there are certain ones that are always supposed to be included, certain ones that always
Well,
must be included, and we can never have a conversation about it like an adult, because that would obviously be too that could risk that I might not get what I want, and I'm not willing to take that risk, because I just know way too well that this is that way it must be.
right. Well, like to be fair, like I was saying before, I wouldn't say that's a fair analysis of secularism, like in general as a whole. Like as Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about in their newest book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which I talk about all the time. They talk about how this group of people with this ideology that you're describing, they're a very small but very vocal minority that have way too much power and influence on the media and where people get their news from. And yeah, you're totally right about the um, that aspect that they say, like it's common anyway for them to say, no, I don't have any ideologies. These are just like inherent a priori truths, basically, and you can't question them.
Yeah, well, there's Nassim Taleb there, Black Swan fame. His point in that situation is always to bring up the idea of a vegetarian at a dinner party. It's like, no, they don't co-op and they don't live in everything. But it's like if you have a choice to make like really nice and something with chicken, well, make one chickpea dish. It serves all the things. So it's so many reasons as to why the wheel gets the grease in so many situations. So even if it is a minority, there's a place for that's valid, but at the same time, minorities often are as powerful or more powerful than majority for reasons that might not change. So it might not even be always relevant that it's a minority. So
Yeah. Well, I just like I said, it's there's something weird going on with your sound. Like I said, it's a minority, but they have way too much influence. Are you still there? Your sound
yeah,
got all weird. Okay,
I'm still here. I just need to.
okay. Your sound started sounding really weird, but yeah, I mean, like that's why I said that it's a minority, but they have way too much power, and people listen to them as if they actually do represent a majority. You still there? Hmm. Looks like he might have dropped out there. He said he might. So, yeah, we'll take that as the end of this episode there then. So, I'll do my outro here and maybe Shane will be back and maybe not. But so yeah, thanks to everyone for watch. Oh yeah, I did get kicked out. All right. Thanks to everyone for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Hope you liked this shorter one, a little longer than we said, but an hour is fairly short for the like two or hour longer ones that I sometimes do. Just this assessment of the recent re-election of Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada and our thoughts about that. And I like how we evolve the conversation into how to attempt to have better conversations in order to have a higher probability of achieving our desired goals, and also the importance of creative expression. That's very important and interesting too. So yeah, anyway, thanks also to those of you who subscribe to my channel, like this video, share it, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. And also, even if people have ideas that are fucking disgusting, try to understand that they are people and you could be that person very easily. The the fact that you were born into the family and culture that you were born into, that was totally fucking random and you could easily be that person. And all right. And oh yeah, of course, most importantly, I love you all. And adios until next time, everyone.